Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take another look at the recently released Dying Light 2 Stay Human, and see how its final retail release has evolved since its prior showcases at E3 2018 and 2019. For this analysis, I'll be playing Dying Light 2 on the PC, running at a 4K resolution, with all of its settings cranked up to their highest values, including the very demanding ray tracing options. That being said, when discussing things like general gameplay mechanics, narrative differences, or level layouts, I'll also be re-enabling Nvidia's DLSS in its quality setting to help clean up the performance on my end. Also, bear in mind that while we will be taking a look at some visual elements like textures, the footage on the left will ultimately look more blurry at times due to the video compression. So, the primary focus for this video will be more on the environmental layout, mission structure, gameplay mechanics, and the overall design. Alright, so starting off our comparison, we have the initial cinematic gameplay reveal premiered back in 2018. In this first sequence, the demo kicks off with the protagonist, Aiden, desperately running through a dark interior area filled with the undead. He then dives through a window and rolls out onto a pergola into a large back alley location adjacent to a nearby church tower. Right away, we're off to a very interesting start here, as this entire alley is completely missing from the final retail build. I pretty much sweep the entire Old Villador district back and forth searching for something even closely resembling this location, and there just isn't anything, especially not around the bizarre tower as suggested here. What's even more interesting though is the total redesign to both the visual makeup of the game and the aesthetic. There's a lot of cinematic post-processing effects at play here, giving the demonstration a crisp yet filmic quality. And the many different supposed climbable objects in this backyard parkour playground have a sort of hybrid of modern and mid-19th century architecture. It's also gorgeously detailed, with some great high-quality textures, specular lighting, vegetation, and volumetric effects that give it a very polished look. But, as it turns out, this was just a prototyped proof of concept, likely to help guide the art team towards an actual playable experience. Therefore, the final retail build looks almost nothing like this reveal, with a more exaggerated color tone and far less complex level structures in this particular region of the map. The buildings, for example, are spaced out much more in this final version, with back alley areas usually housing large open fields with areas to fight zombies or bandits. You'll also find that the architectural designs are far less complex in the final version, with mostly square structures topped with mansard rooftops and very little variety to them. However, it is worth noting that the vegetation along these rooftops is substantially more dense than it was previously suggested. The idea was definitely still there, as there are big trees growing out of the rooftops of these larger structures in the center of the town. But the retail build is filled with these lush, bright green and yellow trees everywhere, contributing even more so to the game's final, bright tone. Moving on, we have some basic parkour mechanics, all of which do appear in the final game in one way or another. Players can shuffle up slanted surfaces, which is used a great deal later in the game, and the monkey bars are used extensively for traversal. Once Aiden climbs to the top here, he then pulls out a pair of binoculars to spot the water tower. Not only are the binoculars also in the retail build, but this water tower is one of the very few structures that are actually present in the final game as well. Even more interesting though, is this castle in the distant background here. While this castle is nowhere close to the water tower in the retail build, it is also in the game, and can be seen way off in the distance with a clear view. After spotting the tower, Aiden then leaps off the building and grabs a rope dangling in the middle of this large street below. He then leaps to a large advertisement banner on the opposite wall and uses a knife to slide down it safely to the street. In the retail build, ropes are also included as a new form of traversal, though like other climbable objects, it has been given a bright yellow color to help players more easily identify it as a usable asset in the environment. Unfortunately, the cool banner knife maneuver Aiden uses in the demo is not a feature in the final game. Knives are instead only used for throwing at enemies or stabbing enemies with a takedown. That being said, players can still use their new wall running ability to cling to certain surfaces and slide down a pretty significant distance if they want to descend faster. Now, before we move on to the next scene, I also wanted to note the level of detail in this environment here. While the final retail build is certainly very nicely detailed for what it is, there's no denying that this initial demonstration showcased a much more diverse and rich-looking lower street area. There's lots of uniquely broken windows, completely different looking buildings with variable height, and even a dead horse lying in the street that I've yet to ever come across in the retail game. Skipping ahead, we have another shot of one of the rooftop makeshift structures that Aiden does a quick two-step parkour move through. In the retail version, you can dive through some similar structures, but the animations aren't quite as fluid as the pre-rendered animations shown previously. After this, the player then steps over to the edge of the rooftop to view a long street that leads towards the water tower at the far end. Once again, the architecture and general level design is not at all the same in the final game. All streets leading to this tower offer much shorter buildings that are at most 3 stories tall, whereas in the demo, the buildings are between 6 and 7 stories. And again, the architecture is more varied and interesting in this version. Aiden then proceeds along the edge of the roof where he quickly peeks left to see a truck driving on the road below. He then leaps off the building and grabs the side of the truck with yet another pre-rendered animation. None of this can be performed in the final game. In fact, in this entire district, I have never once seen a vehicle actually moving, mission or otherwise. There are vehicles later in the game, but nothing quite as dynamic as this appears. Skipping forward, we have the wide-angle shot of the water tower itself. This is about the only shot that seems to line up even remotely close in this demo. You'll notice though that the shorter tower off to the side isn't facing the same direction. That's because trying to view this tower from the same perspective is impossible due to the level layout. The tower itself is also quite different now, with large brick struts surrounding a central column, as opposed to the simplistic geometric design from before. There's also now a large wooden structure poking out from the top, with a crate hanging from a rope, whereas in the E3 showcase, the tower looks pretty much untouched. Then we get to probably one of the more disappointing changes, the confrontation with the 2 individuals at the top of the tower. Not only can you not perform this awesome monkey bar kick to defeat one of the enemies, but here you get a really clear idea of how much the art direction for the game has been altered. The scale and density of this original conceptual design was absolutely stunning, with lots of tall spires, mansard rooftops mostly coated in grass, and only a few trees here and there. The world looks much more dreary here, almost like an abandoned city, as opposed to the final build where life appears to have rebounded a great deal, with a tremendous amount of trees lining the rooftops, and lots more makeshift structures like windmills spread throughout. You'll also notice that the large central triumphal arch has been cut out entirely, which is a pretty surprising omission considering its very prominent presence in this reveal. When discussing how choosing to side with the peacekeepers in this particular mission helps to alter the world, the video then cuts to a revised wide shot of the city, where dozens more makeshift structures like windmills dominate the skyline, bringing it a little bit more in line with the default appearance of the retail game. This then cuts to a demonstration of the running water coming from a street-level water fountain. This exact benefit can be found in the game, though the AI demonstration soon after feels a bit exaggerated. There are some random encounters on the streets, like peacekeepers needing to be freed from bandits if you sided with the bazaar, but I've never witnessed anything like this large-scale public execution shown here. The peacekeepers themselves are also wearing much less brightly colored armor in the retail game, which is an interesting design decision considering how much brighter everything else seems to be. And that's pretty much it for the 2018 demo. So let's move on now to the slightly more accurate 2019 demonstration. Now, unlike the first reveal, the 2019 demo was most likely an actual playable build of the game. Animations here feel more fluid and more believable, and while the lighting and level of detail are still well beyond the final release version, the actual level layouts themselves and mission designs seem to match up more closely. This demo starts off with Aiden washing his face in a bar's bathroom sink. After having a bit of an episode here, he walks out of the room and into the bar area, where he's greeted by Frank. Now, right away, there's some pretty easy to spot changes here. The biggest and most apparent change is to the lighting and shadowing, with several light positions and many areas like this sink lacking detail shadowing like we saw before. And then of course we have our character model for Frank, that, while definitely more detailed overall in this final version, does look a bit less natural due to the rework to the lighting. And then there's all the other details in this bar, like the number of NPCs, the scaled down volumetric lighting effects, and the addition of a new dialogue sequence with the bartender that wasn't shown before. It's a much less immersive scene overall. But there's a lot to get through here, so let's move on to this discussion with Matt upstairs. Here we can observe a significant reduction in environmental detail in a relatively simple scene. You'll notice that in the E3 build, there's 2 candles, a mug, and a piece of meat with a knife stuck into it, on top of what looks like a tree stump plate. But in the retail build, only the mug remains. Even more curiously is that when viewing this particular area outside of the mission, the tree stump and skewered meat are present again. So it is a bit unclear why these details may have been left out. Next, we have the big reveal of downtown, where Aiden opens the door to show a gorgeously detailed post-apocalyptic metropolis, with a ton of attention to detail stretched for several blocks. Like with the original reveal, this demonstration looks to showcase a really dirty, realistic art style, with a sort of dusty appearance to the large abandoned glass windows on either side of the street, and a mostly gray and brown color tone. In the retail build, however, the game is substantially more colorful, with a vibrant sun illuminating lots of bright greens, blues, and reds along the various building facades, along with the bright green vegetation and moss growing around all the edges. By itself, it is a gorgeous looking environment, but again, very stylistically different from the gritty take from before. The mission here plays out about the same as before. The player heads down the stairs and meets up with another character who explains the situation, and then points out a van filled with enemies down below. But the character, Juan, has been moved to a lower platform. His and everyone else's voice recordings have been redone, and the reduction to the general level of detail is undoubtedly apparent across the board. Like less environmental decor, less shadowing, and just less depth overall. The melee combat demonstrated here does play out about the same in-game. The E3 demo does show some more nuanced animations that aren't in the final build, like the way Aiden switches on his electric mod here, whereas in the final build, this seems to be automatically triggered like it was in the first game. But otherwise, things like the gore, the blocking, the dodges, all of these can still be performed the same way. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, we have the exciting chase sequence. Surprisingly, most of what happens in this dynamic sequence does still function the same in the final game. The layout of this large downtown area almost perfectly mirrors what we saw in the demo. There's a few tweaks to the position of things like ramps and changes to the color of ropes and tarps like I indicated earlier. But the actual path that Aiden takes in the demo can be followed very closely in the final game, at least at first. Things only start to really change once the player reaches this balcony. In the E3 demo, the player is stuck looking for the fleeing vehicle, and manages to spot them using binoculars. But in the retail build, the vehicle is very clearly marked, and to keep the mission from failing, the player is forced to abandon the route from the demo, as this path will take the player out of range of the radio signal. From here, Aiden grapples to a beam and then uses the paraglider to descend to a lower office building. Both of these features are retained in the final game, and even this connecting building down below matches up very closely. It's not until the player reaches this next floor that we see another big change, where instead of there being a bedroom filled with several zombies and a boarded up window, the player will climb up into a mostly empty room with a single lone zombie sitting by an open window. As expected, you can do a double dropkick to send the zombie flying, but it's a shame that the wooden panels weren't included here. After leaping out of this building, things start to really deviate. This entire makeshift structure, complete with its unique spinning drill piece at the corner, are not present in the final game. In fact, there's not even a building in this general vicinity, which completely messes up what was a pretty consistent path so far. If you continue following the general orientation of the demo, you will eventually arrive to this apartment complex, which can be identified by its playground to the left. But the interior doesn't match up with anything shown in the demo. The good news is that the awesome takedown performed on this zombie is an actual move in the game, and is easily one of the most fun moves to perform, considering it can be used from stupid high up on both human or zombie enemies for a quick descent to the ground. Following this takedown, Aiden then runs over to a nearby ledge and looks out to a river and spots the truck once again, and then proceeds to parkour through several narrow paths along a large series of connected buildings. While there are buildings that match this architectural style, the layout of the obstacles are completely changed here, with no table to slide under and no random human NPC getting in the player's way. As the chase turns back towards the city center, the layout is all over the place, with the only notable mechanic being this pole vaulting maneuver that can still be performed. And finally, the chase ends unceremoniously, with the truck arriving at a garage in the retail build, as opposed to the much more dynamic intermission in the demo, where Aiden crashes into a zombie-filled interior area, highlighting the new Dark Zone gameplay mechanics. From here, the demo goes on for another 17 minutes or so, which I won't be covering as this is apparently the epilogue of the actual retail game, and I'd like to avoid sharing spoilers this early on. Overall, it's pretty clear that what we received in the final release of Dying Light 2 is not what we were previously shown. For one, the art design has shifted drastically, ditching its dark, almost gothic style to be much brighter and more lighthearted to some extent. That's not to say the game's not mature, as there's plenty of mature themes and elements throughout, but the game seems to really embrace its more fun and goofy side, with insane moves and less realistic physics systems. It's absolutely a shame we never got to experience these more dynamic, choice-based worlds, with their gorgeous cinematic vistas and flashy set pieces. But the final game retains almost all of those really cool gameplay mechanics that really build on what made the original game so much fun to play. There's still a lot of cut features though, like pulling down environmental hazards on enemies, and this single-shot rifle called the Scorpio, that I never once found throughout my playthrough. But even without all these features, I do feel that Dying Light 2 has more than enough new content and features to satisfy new and old players alike. But what do you guys think? Are you happy with the final retail build of Dying Light 2? Or are you disappointed by something that was cut out? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.